Cardinal Fernandez is at it again. Yes, the great mind running the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, whose job it is, given to him by Pope Francis, to bring the church's doctrines and its theology up to date, to really implement the new ecclesiology in the church that is somehow so different from the ecclesiology of the church before Vatican II that the mass that developed organically from apostolic times until 1962 is no longer compatible with the church. And you can expect more documents like Fiducia Supplicans to be issued because he made some pretty big hiring decisions that were released in the news yesterday afternoon. You see, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith is being rewired, or reformed, if you would like to misuse an overly used word. And it's being changed, it's being reformed to fit the new religion and secular values. This has been an ongoing process for some time. It even goes back to Pope Francis's decision to downgrade the now dicastery from the doctrine of the faith from being a congregation. To give you an idea of the scope of this change, it's been pointed out ad nauseum that Cardinal Fernandez is morally unfit for that position, given his, we'll call it, proclivities of writing impure poetry and making some rather disturbing allusions to our Lord and to Our Lady in his impure poetry and other writings. But some of the greater minds that have had that position were Cardinal Ottaviani in the 1950s and 60s, Cardinal Ratzinger in the 1980s until he became Pope Benedict XVI, and other greater minds before them. We now have Cardinal Fernandez running this position. And he has gone on a bit of a hiring spree, as we'll talk about, to bring in like-minded people to help change the faith into the new religion. So we go to Ed Penton on Twitter. He's a Catholic journalist, and he is actually a journalist, not someone hiding their program behind the title of journalist. And he tells us that Father Maurizio Chiodi has been appointed today, meaning yesterday, as consultor to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Okay. Now, you might recognize him because I did a video on this guy using this article that Mr. Penton linked to, and we'll talk here about that article. We'll go over it again because it's important to know who this guy is, because he's quite the character. See, the news articles I'm going to show you in a second don't really do this justice. Father Chiodi is like a less charismatic James Martin with a deeper focus on really terrible theology. And as we'll see, he's not the first to get this promotion. Mr. Penton has an article linked to this tweet that he wrote a few months ago about this heretic, and so we're going to go over it. So the headline from the National Catholic Register is, New John Paul II Institute professors questions church orthodoxy on the James Martin sin and chemical barriers to having kids. Father Maurizio Chiodi and Father Pier David Genzi currently teach moral theology at the University of Northern Italy in Milan, and both are well known for their questioning of moral absolutes. We're not going to focus on the other guy. He hasn't been brought into this. This is, again, a refresher for you to know who he is. But again, here, core of this is the concept of moral absolutes. And this is directly related to synodality because Father Chiodi is also a consultor at the Synod of Synodality. He's actually one of the participants, where they place a group of people at the tables and make them leave their episcopal offices behind. Priests and bishops and even the Pope all sit together at the same table as if they're equals to have a dialogue and listening session. It's a distortion of the hierarchical nature of the church. And this one was invited by Pope Francis, along with James Martin and a few others, because they reject moral absolutes. They're stacking the deck on the Synod of Synodality, and here's some proof of it. Here's a refresher on who this man is. Quote, Father Chiodi, whom Archbishop Paglia appointed as a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life in 2017, is to teach, quote, theological ethics of life at the Institute. Father Genzi is to lecture on the anthropology and ethics of birth. Both professors whose appointments follow highly contentious removals of long-serving lecturers in July are well known for their questioning of moral absolutes. In 2017, Father Chiodi gave a controversial Rome lecture on Humanae Vitae. in which he used chapter 8 of Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation on the family, Amoris Laetitia, to justify the chemical barriers to having kids used in some cases. More recently, he gave an interview to the Italian bishop's newspaper Avvenire, in which he asserted that while each person with the James Martin inclination is called to chastity, quote, under certain conditions, and depending on circumstances, the unnatural relationships can be, quote, the most fruitful way for persons with these diabolical inclinations to, quote, enjoy good relations. The interview appeared to suggest that Father Chiodi was open to considering James Martin activities as, quote, objectively good, according to bioethicist Tommaso Sangrerio, writing in the Italian Catholic daily La Nuova Bassola Quotidiana, end quote. Obviously, he didn't call it diabolical and a couple other things there. I do have to be careful about how we talk about the chosen ones on this platform. And to be sure, the James Martin crowd are the chosen ones at this moment by secular authorities. And they are tightening their grip. Our hosts are on things as we head to November. So just be advised that we have to be careful. But in general, you get the idea. This theologian rejects moral absolutes, meaning he rejects the Ten Commandments, which are moral absolutes written in literal stone. He rejects the doctrines of the church and the magisterium, which teaches moral absolutes. And he has given a promotion to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith to help a cardinal who also rejects moral absolutes. And that cardinal works for a man the world accepts as pope who rejects moral absolutes. Anyone who rejects the moral doctrines of the faith is, by definition, someone who is, at the very least, coming up real close to heresy, if not outright heresy. And this man we're talking about here is a heretic. A man who rejects the moral doctrines of the faith is now working with Cardinal Fernandez to write documents defending the moral doctrines of the faith. This is the definition of clown world, and we are its residents, unfortunately. Well, we will turn now to a post by Matthew Hazel on X. Mr. Hazel is a contributor to Rorate Caeli, New Liturgical Movement, and other places. He got his hands on the official announcement from Rome about this rather terrible news of appointments, because he's not the only one there who got appointed to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. According to Mr. Hazel, quote, 28 new consultors to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith today. As far as I can tell, 24 Italians, with 1 Swiss, 1 Colombian, 1 Indian, and 1 Chilean, 0 Africans. A running theme in this pontificate. I've got a video later this week that's going to show you an uncomfortable truth about the African bishops, that they are hypocrites on the being steadfast on the morality of the faith. They will reject the James Martin sin, but seem to be the biggest champions of the church, changing her moral teachings on the number of people who can be in the sacrament of holy matrimony. That's kind of a problem, and it's a hypocrisy on their part. But when it comes to this issue, the sin we associate with James Martin, you see here a running theme. Francis is sidelining them. Why do you think that is? Because he wants to change the church's teaching to some degree on that, give ground to the secular authorities. So you see a long list of names here. And there's Maurizio Chiodi, and there's a whole bunch of other names who have not really come up in the news, but I suspect people are going to be digging into these figures as time goes on. I wouldn't trust any single one of the names on this list. But there are other things in this that are kind of a giveaway. As Mr. Hazel says, this is quite aside from the clear unsuitability of at least one new consultor, Father Chiodi, who a couple of months ago, lest we forget, was also named a member of one of the Synod on Synodality study groups on, quote, controversial doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical issues. It's reported by Diane Montagna. It was on July 9th that Pope Francis named him, who has argued that we need to consider the possibility that James Martin activities can sometimes be morally good, as one of only 7 members of the Synod on Synodality study group on controversial doctrinal, pastoral, and ethical issues. Like we keep saying, it's baked into the cake, folks. So we're going to turn to Info Vaticanus for some more details on who this man is. They give us this headline. The Pope appoints the heterodox Maurizio Chiodi as a consultant to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And heterodox is one of those words that kind of hides things. It's not a word you hear every day, but it's the opposite of orthodox. Orthodox means right belief, right? Orthopraxis is another word you don't hear very often, meaning right practice. Orthodox means right practice. Heterodox means not right practice. That's what it means. This appointment was, as you can see, part of a larger appointment to a larger list of appointments to the dicastery now for the doctrine of the faith, as we saw in Mr. Hazel's post. But to get an idea of who he is, let's go to this Info Vaticana article. Quote, "It is worth pointing out the most significant controversies that have plagued the priest, such as his opinions on the use of chemical barriers to having kids. In a lecture given in 2017, Father Chiodi suggested that in certain circumstances, the use of these barriers could be considered morally acceptable within Catholic doctrine, in contrast to what was expressed in the encyclical Humanae Vitae of 1968 and Casti Connubii in the 1930s, which strictly prohibited the use of these non-natural barrier methods. Chiodi had also been criticized for his more heterodox approach to the ethics of the flesh. In his works, he has advocated for pastoral discernment that takes into account the complexities of modern life and the particular situations of each person, which has sometimes been interpreted as an opening toward more liberal positions on issues such as the James Martin sin, cohabitation, and marriage. In an interview last August, he again argued that, quote, we need to rethink traditional teaching on the James Martin sin and those chemical barriers. On the other hand, its closeness to the ideas promoted by Pope Francis, especially in relation to the apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, has been another focus of controversy. Chiodi has defended the idea that the document allows for greater openness on issues such as access to communion for divorced and remarried people, and the possibility of individualized discernment in complex situations. The Pontifical Academy for Life, of which Chiodi is a member, has undergone a significant change in its membership and approach under Francis's pontificate. Chiodi has been part of a new current that is more open to dialogue with modernity on bioethical issues. These transformations have been strongly criticized by some sectors within the Vatican, who argue that the Academy has abandoned its commitment to the unrestricted defense of everything decent. End quote. So, yes, you remember all those stories about the Pontifical Academy here being essentially turned into the Pontifical Academy for Moloch? That man was working. He's one of the central figures in that effort. So for a job well done, he is now being promoted to a position in the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. I want to bring up something that's going to be an unpleasant reminder for some of you. There has been a going rumor that there's going to be a consistory announced here in the coming weeks, probably for December or January. If you look at the retirement numbers for the Cardinals, a number of them are going to retire, putting them below the required number of 120 cardinals who can participate in the next conclave that will choose the Roman pontiff after Francis goes to his judgment. What does that mean? That means canon law requires that there be more cardinals made. And so what they typically do is make more cardinals than is necessary so that they can then be, so that when cardinals pass away or retire, you get the number needed to fix this problem, to get back to the number they need. And that always creates a downstream effect because a lot of these cardinals get jobs in the Roman Curia, leaving open their dioceses. So what happens? Well, then you need a new archbishop somewhere. So a bishop gets made an archbishop. And then that bishop's old diocese needs somebody new. So either a bishop is transferred to replace him in a better diocese, or you get an auxiliary bishop who becomes a bishop. And then what happens? Then you get priests made into auxiliary bishops. And sometimes you can bypass a lot of that process by having a priest made a bishop who works exclusively in the Roman Curia, has a symbolic diocese somewhere that doesn't even exist anymore, and has some parish or something that he goes and says mass at, but is otherwise a bishop. That can happen too. And that is what will probably happen with him for a job well done. This is all part of a larger problem with these appointments. See, these appointments show what the current movement in the Catholic Church is actually about: an open rejection of the old faith and the old morality of Catholicism. If you need proof of that, here's someone very close to Pope Francis, publicly using his rather high stature among the laity to go after Bishop Strickland for things he said recently. The headline is Francis biographer Austin Ivere blasts Bishop Strickland, calls James Martin a faithful priest. I can't even say those words out loud without choking down laughter. It's ridiculous on its face. I usually refer to Austin Ivere as the professional Francis fan fiction writer. Yesterday, in my live stream, I told people to get a copy of his book, The Great Reformer, the first edition. You have to get a first edition because it really goes into the background on Pope Francis's background in Argentina. Actually, no, it's for today's video. That'll be going live shortly after this live stream because there's news on that front. And this is the man who wrote that book. He's also got this really strange hobby of finding Latin masses in his area that he lives in the United Kingdom that aren't following Traditionis Custodes to the letter and reporting them to the bishop. And if the bishop doesn't do anything about it, to Rome to get them crushed. To give you an idea of the caliber of man we are talking about here. And he has decided to take some cheap shots at Bishop Strickland, who has already been canceled. But I guess you could do worse to him if Francis really wanted to. So the question I want you to consider is this. What does he mean by faithful priest? Is James Martin a faithful priest to Catholicism or to Pope Francis personally? If you mean Pope Francis personally, then yes, I would totally agree. He is totally loyal to the ape of the church. But to imply that James Martin is a good Catholic priest is an out-and-out falsehood. This piece is really short. We'll go over it. Quote, Austin Ivere is considered one of Pope Francis's most trusted journalists. It is even said that the Pope sometimes uses him as an unofficial spokesman. As a good pair, he always comes to the defense of the Pope and everything that surrounds him. He likes to battle on social media against everything that gets in his way. On this occasion, he has attacked Bishop Strickland too harshly and has made serious accusations against the American prelate, rather unmerciful and unsynodal gesture on the part of Ivere. It seems that Ivere does not like the fact that a bishop, already ousted by Francis, can express himself freely. Is this not what the enthusiasts of the synodal church are demanding? On September 20th, Bishop Strickland again lashed out at the synod, saying that it is shaping up to be a planned attack on the basic teachings of our beautiful Catholic faith. Strickland called on everyone to remain steadfast in the light of Christ and to say loud and clear no. Strickland criticized Pope Francis for having decided to personally invite pro-sin Father James Martin and Cardinal Supich to the October Synod, both of whom are two of the most controversial figures in the U.S. Church. Well, Austin Ivere, who presents himself as a biographer of Pope Francis, has decided to respond to Bishop Strickland to make it clear that no dissent of any kind is acceptable. Quoting professional Francis fanfiction writer Austin Ivere, let us stand firm in the light of truth, the truth of Christ, and repudiate this blatant attempt by a dissident bishop removed from his diocese to gain money and followers by attacking the Holy See, lying about the synod, and defaming faithful priests, Ivere writes. Let's pause there. Bishop Strickland is apparently motivated by financial gain, according to Austin Ivere. I want you to let that thought marinate in your mind as long as you need it to take to make it make any sense. Because if he was motivated by financial gain, Bishop Strickland would have been an outspoken defender of Pope Francis consistently. He would have been the most strident implementer of all of his changes to the faith. He would have crushed dissent against Pope Francis. He would literally be hanging out with Cardinal Supich all the time if he was interested in financial gain. That's how you do it. You ever see, by the way, posts on social media about, politicians when they started their federal career, what their net worth was, and then at this point in this year, right now, what their net worth is, and it almost always is a ridiculous increase in their net wealth. I'd love to see that about churchmen, to see what the personal wealth is of a lot of these churchmen and what it was when they became bishops and what it is now. These really high-profile ones. I'd love to see that data. Let's continue. The charge against Bishop Strickland is extremely serious, accusing him of wanting to make money by attacking the Pope while boasting that he is a removed bishop and treating him like an outcast by labeling him a dissident. As could not be otherwise, he also comes to the defense of James Martin, whom Strickland has targeted not without reason. James Martin is one of the priests who is causing the greatest scandal and confusion on Mother Earth, but to Ivere, he is a faithful priest whom a dissident bishop is trying to defame. End quote. This is, of course, on its face nonsensical. It literally is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. Now, we are going to end this with a short correction of all this nonsense issued by a priest. This entire broader movement of bringing the faith up to the times. And everybody we've talked about here, except, of course, Bishop Strickland, who was the target of the attacks by these, have been trying to push for the making of the church relevant to modern values. That's what Father Chiodi's whole exercise is. That's why he's there at the synod. That's what the purpose of the synod is to secularize and de-Christianize the Catholic faith. We're going to go here back to another piece from Vatican. They've been really just nailing it in the last few days. A priest named Father Valentin de Toledo issued this. So the headline is, "The church is not a political party and does not have to adapt to the times, but rather return to its origins." Of course, you got to be careful with returning to its origins, that you don't fall into the archaeologism and antiquarianism errors condemned by Pius XII. You're not trying to return to ancient first century practices that went away over time, or making weird claims about antiquity and things that are not actually backed up by anything remotely true. But the sentiment is generally correct. We don't need to get with the times. We need to remember that the faith is eternal and get back to our eternal practices, which have gone away. Now, this is a social media priest and influencer that many of you won't be familiar with because his content's not in English. And I'm not going to read the whole article here, but here's his take on whether the church needs to get with the times. Synodality, remember, is like Vatican II. It was both of which have been expressly stated to have the purpose, or one of the purposes, of trying to get the church to conform to the spirit of the age, to open the windows of the church to let in some fresh air and some of the wisdom of the world. It's been a disaster anytime it's been tried, and here's the priest's response to that idea. So we go here, and we go to this part where he says, quote, "Regarding young people, Father Valentin stresses their sensitivity to social problems, but warns the growing disorientation they suffer. They have been taught to live in the moment, but not to face difficulties, which generates an emotional fragility that, according to him, is worrying in an increasingly fragile society. When asked whether the church should evolve to adapt to the times, the priest is clear. The church is not a political party and does not have to adapt to the times, but rather return to its origins. For him, the church's message is eternal and should not change, although he does believe that the way of communicating it can be adapted to new media. In this sense, he reaffirms his commitment to celibacy and his rejection of the blessing of James Martin Parings, maintaining that fidelity to the Word of God must be unwavering. I cannot love anyone as I love God, he says, expressing the intensity of his relationship with divinity." And that is an attitude we should have from our priests. Wouldn't that be nice if most of them had that attitude? What you see with synodality is the sort of institutionalization of relativism. That's all it is. It's relativism. It's go along to get along. Let's all be friends. Kumbaya, kumbaya nonsense. It's taking the church and making it as least and inoffensive as possible to weaken it to the point of irrelevancy. That's what the end game will be. That may not be what they think it is, but that is what it will be if they get their way. And we need more priests to stand up and speak. We need more bishops to stand up and speak, even though there's a great risk when they do it. So, are you at all surprised that Cardinal Fernandez has got a whole bunch of new priests coming in, including at least one who makes you suspicious of the rest, who has a long track record of saying the church was wrong? Because remember, when they want to change the church's teaching or its practice, it's saying that the church has been wrong. It's an attack on the magisterial authority, on the inerrancy of sacred scripture, and on the very concept of a teaching magisterium itself. If the church has been wrong on that sin that cries out to heaven for justice for its entire history, then what's the point of trusting the church on anything? This isn't like discovering that maybe some administrative issue on how the Vatican runs its operations internally hasn't exactly been the most efficient way, and they've been kind of just doing it forever. And so you change like some administrative procedure. It's nothing like that. This is a fundamental nuts and bolts issue on how we are to live and what the church teaches us using the authority given to her by Christ to teach on a fundamental nuts and bolts issue that affects the lives of everyday people now. If the church was wrong about that and needs to change that teaching, why should we be Catholic? Why should we trust anything they say? It's a fundamental question that they refuse to answer. It's why they tell, it's at least in part why they tell us that the multiplicity of religions is the part of the active will of God, that he actively wills it. It's because they called it a treasure from God, which means it's part of his active will. It's relativism. It's reducing religion to being some nice sentimental feelings about some vague impersonal creator. It's not even remotely Catholic. All right, folks. Let me know if you have any final thoughts in the comments here. You're welcome, Richard. Glad to see that you are actually feeling better. For those of you who watched Sunday, Richard is doing better. Amazingly, your prayers seem to have been answered to some degree, and I am very happy to report that. All right, folks. I make money off Father James Martin. We've sold one T-shirt, and they make fun of him. They mock him. That's what they are. And we'll probably be designing some new shirts a little more serious in the near future. So if there's an accusation there, Knights of Mary, you should retract it. If you actually look at them, they make fun of him. Anyway, folks, if there are any final thoughts in the comments, please, in the live chat, please get them in now. Otherwise, we will wrap this up. Sources will be posted at returntotradition.org, as is always the case. You should check out the new video for today, which goes live in about half an hour after this is over. I should warn you, it looks like a possibility in that the news in that video will be very headline making if it actually turns out to be true. So, because Francis said something that looks like it's pointing to something we've all been waiting for. Anyway, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.